People who perform autopsies. What's the weirdest crap you've seen? Oh, my time to shine. I did a forensic pathology rotation in medical school in Florida. Was working there one day when they brought an old guy in who had been found in his apartment in the middle of the summer with no air conditioning after about a week. So he had decomposed pretty quickly. When bodies decompose, the bacteria inside you eats the tissue and releases gas, so bodies tend to be bloated. So when they unzipped the body bag, I wasn't surprised to see that. But I was surprised to see that his scrotum was about the size of a football. No exaggeration. This apparently occurred via the same bacteria process. Anyways, I was being keen, and I think they liked me, so they took a large bore needle and stuck it into the scrotum to let the gas escape. Then, they took a lighter and lit the end of the needle, so as the gas was escaping from the scrotum, it burned like a blowtorch. Lasted for about 20 seconds. They justified the process by saying it decreases the smell in the lab. Talk about seeing things that very few other humans have. The scrotum blowtorch. I asked a co-worker who used to work as a coroner's assistant a similar question. He said that one time they were called out to a suicide of an elderly man who lived alone and was sort of a recluse. While cutting out his organs, he came across an 18-inch wooden dildo. Apparently the poor old man had let the dildo get away from him, and instead of going through the embarrassment of getting it removed, he decided to just off himself in his front yard. He literally died of embarrassment. Maybe not so relevant, but when they made a full body x-ray of my grandmom's identical twin sister, not only did it turn out all her organs were mirrored, her heart was on the right side etc, but she also had 4 kidneys. Woman was 60 plus at the time and they never knew before. She and your grandmother could be mirror twins. As for the 4 kidneys, that's bizarre. My friend is a pathologist. She said she threw up once after seeing a semi-liquid brain. Dude turned over his car into a lake in remote nowhere. It got pulled out. They opened his skull and a putty liquid-like mixture. I don't think anyone can blame her for vomiting. The sight would be bad enough, but imagine the smell. That goes for pretty much all these posts. This might not be relative, but a good friend of mine is a coroner. She picks up the bodies. Anyway, she told me this story about how there was this older 400-pound woman who passed away in her house. It was winter time and she didn't have many friends or family, so her body remained undiscovered for 2 weeks. She passed away on a couch which was directly over a heater. When they went to move her, she split right in half long ways. I have a similar story. It didn't happen to be, but a co-worker. We are paramedics. A man was found dead, face down naked in his bathroom. It had been a couple weeks. When they moved him, his schlong stuck to the floor and ripped off. Current pathology fellow. Board certified. Not in forensics though. Participated in 80 autopsies. Weirdest scariest case. House fire. One body recovered after 1+ hour of burning. A body completely charbroiled. Rigid. Limbs curled up against the torso. We raid the chest, abdomen, and head to see if there is anything of interest before dissection. Metal fragments in the chest. Do the autopsy. The internal organs are largely intact despite the significant heat damage to the skin and soft tissue. This is not unexpected. I learn. There is a large 1L hematoma in the chest. There is about a 2 cm jagged opening in the posterior wall of the right ventricle and in the anterior left lateral wall of the right ventricle. Metal fragments embedded in the left lung. Tracing backwards from the heart, a path is found through the posterior thorax with an possible entrance wound in the upper back. Yikes, he was shot? Detectives arrive to morgue. Say they've got the homeowner roommate in custody. They're interrogating him right now. He owns a gun. He's been having frequent noisy arguments with the dead guy tenant that have been observed by neighbors and reported to the police. He was away from home when the fire was happening. Claims no knowledge of any of this. Has no idea what happened to either his house or the dead guy. Detectives high-five each other when we tell them he's been shot and it's definitely homicide. We find out later after they fully interrogate the homeowner. He confesses to shooting the roommate in the back while he is sleeping and then torching his own house to try to hide the evidence. The roommate was actually his tenant and he wouldn't move out, so he killed him. Scary stuff. I have seen so much when I was working in the morgue in Detroit. I've seen baby autopsies, where a bone saw isn't even needed to get through the skull because babies have soft skulls. I have seen people come in bags after being run over by trains. One bag which contained an arm, the other an eyeball, another a foot. The worst thing by far is people who decompose during the summer. I saw a fat man who shot himself in the tub get all bloated and green and get filled with maggots. I could smell him before I even entered the building. I've seen some crap. AMA seconded. I shadowed a medical examiner several times, but the weirdest thing I ever saw still kind of haunts me. There was a woman that died suddenly and had all these bruises on her body. There were detectives and cops all around us because they thought it was a case of domestic violence. However, she was schizophrenic and was not on any meds. During one of her episodes, she would beat herself violently and self-inflict all of these bruises and wounds on her. But the way she died was crazy. She beat herself so much that these bruises developed huge blood clots and broke off into the bloodstream. They eventually ended up in her lungs. Pulmonary embolism. We opened up her lungs and they were just full of blood clots. Her legs were full of them too. She basically beat herself so much that she suffocated. It was so odd. That is so odd. And so sad. My grandmother had a friend who was attending medical school at the University of Pennsylvania. She and her fellow classmates were scheduled for cadaver class where donated bodies were used. My grandmother's friend and her partner were assigned a body at the end of the rather large classroom. When removing the sheet from their assigned cadaver, she discovered that this was her aunt who had died 2 weeks previous. Yikes. The same thing happened to my grandmother, however it was one of her beloved high school teachers and she hadn't heard of her death. My mother is a physician and has always loved telling her cadaver lab story from medical school. At the very beginning of the semester, the med students were paired up with their cadaver. The professor had a policy that if the med student could convincingly attribute cause of death, they would earn some bonus points. My mother was discouraged because her cadaver was an old white-haired lady and death by old age is a difficult task to prove. Much to my mother's surprise, she was the first to earn said bonus points. Her sweet old grandmother cadaver had died from being shot and stabbed multiple times in the back. Man, surprise ending. You would think they would pass on that one for a cadaver lab. I have a good friend who's worked as a coroner and embalmer his whole life. Family business. And he has some sick stories. A man in my town committed suicide by sitting on the train tracks and getting hit by a train. He had to get under the train and pick out his pieces, where he found the guy's hand, forearm and some intestines. He then spent the afternoon walking 1.5 mile strip of train track picking up as many pieces of the guy he could find. Man, people can at least be thoughtful enough to not kill themselves messily. Took a forensic biology night class at a community college which was taught by the county coroner. Second class, he mentioned that human brains turn the consistency of a milkshake after decomposing for a few days, weeks in the skull. They pour them out. I stopped at Chick-fil-A and brought a milkshake to the remaining 13 classes. I'm not a pathologist, but when I was an EMT, I got called to check the well-being of a woman who hadn't been seen for over a month. We found her, all 350 plus pounds of her, dead, probably about 3 weeks. She was bloated and decomposing, but her cat remained well fed. Note that wasn't the worst thing I've seen. Had a class in uni once where someone showed the pics of a case and the room had to guess. The lady with a condom shot in her throat took us the longest. For many years my father was a homicide investigator. He's seen lots of dead bodies. One time, they were all standing around this freshly killed body that had just started going through the rigor mortis process. All of a sudden, the body sat up. 5 grown men, all of them tough Texas good old boy cop, nearly crapped their pants and started running out of the house screaming. The medical examiner who was there had a great laugh. Another time, they got a call from a woman's neighbors that they hadn't seen her in days and her car hadn't moved and the mail was piling up. So they went over to check it out. When they got there, they found that she had hung herself from her high vaulted living room ceiling. By the time anyone arrived, her neck had snapped and the skin has stretched. Her neck was about 5 feet long and her knees were on the floor. Not my story, but a cop told me once that he went on a call to a house because it seemed like it had been abandoned. He goes up to the window to look in and can't really see. It's too dark and it looks like a garbage bag is over the window. So they end up breaking down the door and get swarmed by thousands of flies. Turns out the lights weren't off, but there were flies all over them. The stench was horrible. The body had been decomposing for so long it fused to the couch, and when they tried to move the body they pulled the arm and it ended up ripping off. Mrs. Krabappel and Principal Skinner were in the closet making babies, and I saw one of the babies and the baby looked at me. I'm probably way too late to the game, but I interned at our county coroner's office for a summer for college credit. Saw several dozen autopsies. The first and most haunting one was of a child who had set some things on fire in his grandmother's trailer and then hidden under the bed to keep from getting in trouble. The pathologist had to verify whether he had died of the resulting fire or if he had died of smoke inhalation. He was curled into basically the fetal position, kind of hugging his knees. He was totally blackened and charred. The waistband of his jeans and the tops of his socks had semi-protected his legs, so you could see some severely burned skin there, but it was the only humanesque looking part of him. As soon as the first incision was made revealing the body cavity, the coroner stated carbon monoxide and exited the room while the pathologist continued. Apparently when you inhale large amounts of carbon monoxide, your blood and organs turn this crazy cherry pink color. The body's position with the knees to chest is another indication. He was unconscious and died before any flames ever came in contact with his body. The smell was insane. Kind of a mixture of burnt popcorn and the smell your blowed rear makes when your hair gets caught in it. It looked so incredibly fake that if the actual body were to be used as a Hollywood prop, no one would have found it to be believable. Most interesting and horrifying summer of my life. I feel weird upvoting something so horrible. A friend of mine was a hospice nurse for a time. She told a story about one of her patients dying where the man was sitting in a chair and then keeled forward on his knees and face planted on a tile floor. She arrived to do the paperwork and the crew came to remove the body. They had to tell the family to go wait outside while they took care of it. By this point rigor had set in, so when they tried to pick him up he was stuck in this crouched over position. Even worse, his face had taken the exact shape of the linoleum floor and all the blood had pooled into his face, so it looked like a bunch of raisins that had been flattened against glass. To wheel him out they had to drag his body out of the room, then throw it up on a gurney so he looked like a turtle on its back except with his raisin face. She said it was by far one of the weirdest things she's seen in her 20+ years as a nurse. According to Google, rigor takes anywhere from 2 to 6 hours to set. Why the heck was a hospice of all places leaving people to sit dead for at least 2 hours? I'm in medical school. We started pathology this year, in which we do 1 autopsy a week. It's pretty interesting, although some of the cases can get weird. Because this pathology department is located in a poorer section of my city, they get a lot of people who died in their homes, or were homeless, or bodies from the nearby other university departments. Some notable cases. 2 weeks ago we had an autopsy of an elderly male who was homeless. He had tuberculosis. With tuberculosis, your lungs change from being airy alveolus spaces to becoming filled with necrotic, dead, tissue and pus. 3/4 of all his lung tissue was transformed to what pathologists loving call cheesy necrosis. Last semester we had some sad cases. A 3-day-old premature baby with congenital defects. A 27-year-old woman who died of rectal cancer after having survived breast cancer. Sometimes we'll have practices in the internal medicine department, then come to pathology and see the same person there. Earlier this week we had someone with what was suspected to be an inguinal hernia, but once cut open it looked more like cancer. Often someone comes in, and they look old, but otherwise healthy, and then you open them up and find so many problems. It really is remarkable what humans can live with. One time we had the body of a person with Parkinson's. Their brain really does eat itself up from the inside. That was freaky for me. Oh, we had the body of a person who had hepatitis C for autopsy last semester. Ravaged liver. Usually you see the same things in the organs. Heart failure or signs of heart attacks. Liver showing congestion due to alcohol or infection usually. Lungs where you can just push the air around because of emphysema. But sometimes you have more abnormal things. One time I was slicing a liver and there was a huge cyst with a worm inside. My teacher pulled back the capsule of a kidney a few weeks ago and a cyst burst, spraying fluid high into the air. But supposedly that's common. Anyway, there's probably some things you guys would find freaky, but get really run of the mill after a while. In pathological autopsies, we are trying to see what's wrong. What's abnormal? We spent 2 years with cadavers in anatomy learning what's more normal, and I think we've all adjusted to the normal things found inside our bodies. In any case, it's all super interesting, although I don't quite see how people end up doing it as their job for the rest of their lives. One of my best friends is an autopsy tech at a hospital that allows her to actually cut into the person. One day she was called in for an autopsy on an older woman. She said that when she walked into the room, the other techs asked her if the woman looked strange to her. My friend responded that she looked a bit too thin but nothing else seemed off. The other techs told her to roll the older woman over to see something. When she did, the woman's back was completely gone as well as a bunch of organs. Turns out the old lady had died in a chair and slumped over when she passed. She had a couple dogs and after a few days the dogs got a bit hungry and ate out her back and some organs. Another weird one was from when she went in to get a testicular sample, since she has the smallest hands of the techs, and found a penis pump instead. She said they had a good laugh at that and were all also a bit grossed out. Grossest she did was a burn victim who smelled like barbecue. Saddest, and most common, are babies whose parents smothered them by accident in bed. Not a coroner. Have worked in private security for 15 plus years. Had a gig at a hospital one where the guards had to help move bodies from the hospital rooms to the hospital morgue. One night me and a nurse are lifting the body of an obese woman who had already been placed in a bag to a gurney for transport. As we lifted the body up, it moaned. We dropped her back on the bed, got the bag unzipped, and checked for a pulse. Nothing. The lifting action had expelled air from her lungs, through her vocal cords. The nurse told me, sometimes that happens. My high school jazz band teacher told us a story about his friend in college who was studying to be a doctor. This was the 60s, so it was a pretty ballsy move for a woman. She was friends with the other 2 women in one of her classes and they were constantly harassed by men for their gender, both calling them incapable and ridiculing them or making sexual comments toward them. They got fed up with it and wanted to get back at the guys. They came into the class early one morning and lined the inside of an empty cadaver with foil. Then they filled the stomach with baked beans. When the men entered the room they were eating the mush of a cadaver. A few puked and all were disgusted. My cousin is a detective and when he worked in Homicide, sometimes he would take me on ride-alongs. One time they got a call about a homeless man, and we were nearby, so we swung over to check it out. Anyways, the guy was definitely dead, so when they pulled him off the ground, a giant chunk of his back got stuck under the part of the fence and basically fell apart. That smell. Former Mortician here. Some crazy crap. Hardened arteries actually look and feel like PVC pipe. Trains make surprisingly clean cuts on humans. Heads explode a lot like pumpkins. You can vent decomp gas by puncturing the abdomen and pressing down. You can embalm a male in such a way as to give them an erection. Blood clots can be the same size and texture as a banana slug. Ropes leave necks stretched out after hanging. I've carried 9 human heads in an ice cooler for use in medical school. Lots more I am sure, I just can't think of any right now. My mom is a histologist and used to perform autopsies. As a kid, anytime I went into her work with her I'd see some random body part, whether it was a brain, a foot, or even one time a boob. That's one heck of a way to see your first boob. This will get buried, but a friend of mine works with a team of people that collect organs when someone dies. He has a crazy schedule and gets called up at all hours because there isn't much time after someone dies to harvest all the organs, and it takes some time. In Idaho, he was dissecting the, I think, retinas corneas from a middle-aged woman when she let out a long sigh. Apparently that's pretty common, but he was new at the time and it rattled him. I guess being able to kind of hear her voice after she was dead just messed with him. He hates the job. BTW. Edit. Anatomy. I was helping with an autopsy while I was training to be an X-ray tech. The coroner needed help finding a bullet in the murder victim. We tried to help by X-raying the body, but we were having a hard time finding the exact spot since the guy was huge. After a while of us gagging from the stink and the maggots on the body, the pathologist finally found the bullet in his butthole. The poor guy was shot and the bullet went through the body and got lodged in his butthole. My dad had to perform an autopsy on a man him and his colleagues nicknamed Bugs. His mouth, nose, and eye sockets were riddled with maggots. I can only imagine what bugs' insides looked like. My teacher told us when he was doing his degree that he had an anatomy class, and the male body they used had a hernia into his scrotum. That is in fact the most common type of hernia. Friend of mine wasn't a coroner, but a driver for the coroner's office who would transport corpses to and fro. He claims a cadaver once made a loud belching noise and sat up on the gurney while he was driving it. Scared the crap out of him. Some kind of postmortem reflex. I was an autopsy assistant for a few months before going off to college. I did 15 autopsies in the 3 months I was there. 10 or 11 were suicides. 8 were under 25. 2 just over 40. Stupid reasons too. Weirdest thing I saw was probably a few DVTs the size of my thumb in each calf. The woman had broken her ankle but was very overweight. She was told to walk after she got her walking cast but didn't. One of the DVTs broke off and caused a pay. She was only 50 I believe. Another one. 21-year-old guy. His girlfriend dumps him. So he gets in the car and plows into a retaining wall on the highway. Car stopped. His body stopped. But his heart kept going. Everything transected and fell into his torso. Car then burst into flames. We received a charcoal briquette of a person that had to be identified by dental records. His cooked brain looked like a boiled egg, and the group of friends who had a bet on who could commit suicide first. One guy made it to us after many attempts. I swear he wore 3 pairs of pants just to frick with me. We realized that our pedestrian versus train from a week before was one of the friends in this pact. I'm glad I totally know what a DVT and a pay is. Yup, totally. Surfer, not a coroner. My buddy and I went for a dawn session in NJ in February. As you can imagine, nobody was around. My buddy saw what we thought was a balloon shaped like a person with pants on. We walked within 3 feet of it before realizing it was a very bloated dead guy. He had frozen solid in an amazingly unrealistic way. The cops came and tried to lift him up and his arm broke off at the elbow. Surfer, not a coroner, but they're so similar. Oddly specific question, but I am an autopsy tech. I really can't give specifics, but there was a very large woman who hid bags of chips and bags of narcotics in her fat folds. That was odd. I did an autopsy on a woman who had a boot on her foot from an injury. The lack of movement caused the blood in her leg to clot. The clot then moved from her leg, through her heart, into her lungs, which should have just killed her, but oh no, it kept going, and finally into her brain. The congealed blood spanned the length of her body. Not really an autopsy, but my parents were both EMTs for 23 years. In the late 1980s, they got a call from a woman who said her husband might be dead. They got to the house, and when the woman answered the door, they asked where her husband was. She pointed out into the snow-covered yard and said, "I think that's him over there." They looked to where she pointed, and saw a snow-coated lump with 2 shoes sticking out. They uncovered the man, who apparently had had a heart attack while shoveling snow, and picked him up. He was so stiff, they didn't need a backboard. They attached the monitor leads, as required, and got a perfect heartbeat. This guy was frozen solid, but had a perfect heartbeat. They found out, when they got him to the hospital, that he had a pacemaker. The old monitor was reading its pulses. I don't perform them, but I was interning with a coroner last year and got to witness some. I just wanted to say that the decaying body smell is the worst smell my nose and I have ever encountered thus far. Lead detective on the Dharma case, amazing documentary on Netflix, said it's a smell you can never forget and never describe. Not an autopsy but a cadaver lab. A guy whose stomach was on the other side of his diaphragm. Like at some points in his development the sac sneaked itself up and he had lived his whole life with his stomach in his chest cavity. His died of unrelated causes and his only symptom apparently was some shortness of breath after a big meal. I'm late to the party, but I manage apartments and unfortunately I'm sometimes the first one to find a dead body when I do a welfare check. But the weirdest case that has ever happened was last December. I went to do a home inspection before renewing a lease, routine at our complex, that had been scheduled for a few weeks. The residents in question were a couple in their mid-50s. When I got to the home, it smelled bad but I knocked anyway and one of the residents opened the door. The smell was overwhelming. She acted like everything was normal and I entered. It was quickly apparent she was off her rocker. When I entered the second bedroom, I found her husband dead, propped against a wall and surrounded by food she had cooked for him. The body was bloated and blood was pooling under the skin, but she talked to him like he was alive. I called the police and she was hysterical. I felt so bad. They were both so nice and normal when I had dealt with them before. The coroner said he had been dead about a week. My dad is a paramedic and was once on a call for a suicidal gunshot to the head. The woman, mid-60s, was in the bathroom sitting on the floor between the toilet and bathtub. My dad said there was blood all over the wall and a gun in her lap. When he reached down to take a pulse, required steps, she gasped out, "Oh, my flying head." My dad said he'd crap his pants. Woman lived, had some brain damage. Do necropsies count? If so, here are two. The dog who died from swallowing a kitchen knife. A big one. It looked pretty messy in there. The cow who had eaten a piece of wire that pierced through its stomach wall and proceeded to enter its thorax and stab the heart, which strangely enough did not kill the cow, but resulted in a pericardial infection that did. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.